It was 1992, hardly a week after the start of the new year, and already Nirvana were finding themselves in completely unfamiliar territory. They were preparing for what would likely be one of their biggest performances ever, their first appearance as musical guests on Saturday Night Live, when the news came that their sophomore album had just hit #1 on the Billboard Top 200. Nevermind had outpaced albums by Guns N' Roses, Metallica, MC Hammer, Garth Brooks, and Michael Jackson. And when first-time host Rob Morrow stepped out and announced to the crowd, "Ladies and gentlemen, Nirvana," well, it was set in stone. They were the biggest band in the world. Kurt Cobain had made it. Years later, his wife would describe finding him the next morning. It wasn't that he OD'd, it was that he was dead. If I hadn't woken up at 7, I don't know. Nirvana was not the same band after Nevermind, but understanding why means exploring countless variables and decisions that we can't possibly wrap our heads around. Actually, there's four changes in 1991 that reshaped the band forever. The first, and most obvious, being fame. Nirvana were not totally unknown before the release of Nevermind. In fact, it's often been argued that the only reason they were signed to a major label beforehand is because of their early success. Over their roughly 5 years of collaboration, Kurt Cobain, Krist Novoselic, and new addition Dave Grohl had grown a moderately sized but feverishly loyal fan base of punks and outcasts, a community whose beliefs and backgrounds reflected that of the band themselves. This was important to them. But with the massive success of Smells Like Teen Spirit on MTV and the millions of copies sold of Nevermind, the fan base was quickly shifting. Old high school classmates were asking for autographs, the audiences of their shows were filled with jocks, and Kurt started to grow frustrated. I found myself being overly obnoxious during the Nevermind tour because I noticed that there were more average people coming to our shows, and I didn't want them there. They started to get on my nerves. He added, I was obnoxious and showing my weenie and acting like a frog and dancing around and wearing dresses and just being drunk. I would say things like, "Alright, frat rock, look at all these frat geeks out here." I'm not usually very vocal on stage, but during that tour, I was a jerk. Kurt's frustration would only bloom from here. Not only were the venues booked by the band's consistently underestimating label far too small, resulting in overstuffing, they were also, how do I put this, bad. Cobain would complain on several occasions about not being able to hear himself on stage thanks to consistently malfunctioning monitors. His destruction of one being sometimes credited as what triggered that famous bouncer fight you've probably heard about. All of this culminated in what would grow to be one of Kurt's most infamous traits, his distaste for fame. Though he had wanted nothing more than to be a rock star for much of his childhood, and honestly most of his adulthood, you can't blame the guy for changing his mind once he got it. Fame is more than a cheering audience and your face on TV. It's constant scrutiny, schedules, deadlines, contracts, and guys in suits thinking they know better than you. And after a few months of this, Kurt needed a change. Initially, I just wanted to add some excitement in my life. I never met anyone so outspoken and charismatic. It seems like she's a magnet for exciting things to happen. If I just happened to walk down the street with her, someone might attack us with a knife for no reason, just because she seems like the kind of person that attracts things like that. And I just wanted to piss people off, basically. Courtney Michelle Love. Nobody cares about her middle name, but it just rolls off the tongue better. Much has been said about the whole frontwoman, not all of it entirely nice. She's started feuds in every industry, inspired countless hate songs, and is often described as loudmouthed, rude, domineering, and immature. In other words, she was Kurt Cobain's dream woman. And although for the purposes of this video, Love serves as the second major change of 1991, Kurt and her had history. It all started in January of the previous year when moments after exchanging words for the first time at a bar in Portland, the two were on the floor wrestling. Kurt had been an avid wrestler for much of his youth, but it wasn't long before Courtney had him pinned, and the frontman was in love. Their romance would have to be put on hold, however, as each of them were in a serious relationship at the time. Kurt was with his first girlfriend Tracy Miranda, and Courtney with the Smashing Pumpkins' Billy Corgan. Though in the months that followed, the two would run into each other semi-regularly, each time losing more and more excuses not to smooch until one night on October 12, 1991. The way she explains it, that morning Courtney had flown out to Chicago to spend the weekend with Billy, only to step into his apartment and catch him with another woman. Newly single, she stumbled upon a great coincidence. Nirvana were performing just down the street. Catching the last few minutes of the show, she stormed into a backstage party and made her way directly onto Kurt Cobain's lap. The rest of the night was spent talking, breaking all the rules of early dating and sharing stories of their heartbreaks. It would be those early conversations that would serve as the backbone of their relationship, as they discovered an honest kinship beyond simple physical attraction. Then they screwed. Rumors from the time claim that they did it right there at the center of the backstage party, with everyone watching. But that's just silly. Kurt and Courtney were definitely eccentric, but they never intentionally screwed in front of anyone. At the end of the night, they simply retreated to the frontman's hotel, though Kurt had forgotten he was sharing a room with Dave Grohl. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. I had to leave the room. Kurt and Courtney's romance would only bloom from here. Though you would think Nirvana's upcoming European tour would only drive them apart, as luck would have it, Courtney's band Hole was embarking on a very similar tour at roughly the same time. And even if not all the dates lined up, it didn't really matter to the two of them. They were committed to spending as much time together as possible. That's when we really started falling in love, on the phone. We called each other almost every night and faxed each other every other day. I had like a $3,000 phone bill. From then on, they took every opportunity they got to see each other, even making some for themselves. In a stunning move for someone famously career-oriented, Courtney canceled a show with Hole just to spend a couple days with Kurt in Amsterdam. Not even a month later, they were engaged. I wanted to start having an exciting life. I figured Courtney was the best option. I knew that there wouldn't be a single person in the Nirvana camp that would approve of it because they're all so fucking boring. Their lives are so normal. I hate to say it, but that's just the way I feel. Everyone that I know that we work with, there's not much punk rock going on. There's no one willing to take risks, like, let's just take it. It's always such a strict regimen. Let's get to the show, let's play, let's eat dinner and go to sleep. I just got tired of it. Kurt is almost definitely simplifying his feelings for Courtney here, but that side of their relationship, the true punk do whatever you want, piss people off side, that was definitely in play too. Truthfully, Cobain had been growing apart from his bandmates for a very long time. And while you might assume this was thanks to the money and the separate apartments, and hardly meeting unless they had to, okay, maybe that was a factor, you could definitely trace it back further, all the way to the fall of 1990, when Kurt tried heroin for the first time. Quick pause. From this point on, the name of the drug will be censored, for obvious reasons. Heroin, the third change of 1991, had been a part of Kurt's life since high school. Not only would he later lie about trying it for the first time back then, he also very clearly found the allure of the drug captivating. Partly because of that old dream of his and many famous rock stars being users, but more so because it was a powerful opiate, and he liked weak opiates. However, when presented with the opportunity to try heroin, all of his high school friends uphold that he rejected it at every turn. Kurt wouldn't hang out with me after that. I was trying to find heroin, a drug I'd never tried and he'd never tried, and he would lecture me. Why do you want to kill yourself? Why do you want to die so badly? But by the tail end of 1990, Kurt was in a very different headspace. He was heartbroken after being dumped by his second girlfriend, Toby Vale, and deeply depressed. Feeling he had nothing left to lose, he went out and gave heroin a shot. And he liked it. But he was broke, addiction is expensive, and he was busy. Nirvana had just signed to DGC, and production on their next album was only months away, so heroin stayed on the back burner, never truly leaving the frontman's mind. Until the tail end of 1991, when Cobain was in a similar spot. He wasn't heartbroken, but he was overwhelmed. Fame wasn't anything like what he had expected, and something awful was happening in his stomach. An undiagnosable pain that had come and gone for years at this point had returned with a vengeance. He had the money, he had the free time, and he'd had enough of waiting. I decided to use heroin on a daily basis because of an ongoing stomach ailment that I had been suffering from for the past 5 years, and that had literally taken me to the point of wanting to kill myself. For 5 years, every single day of my life, every time I swallowed a piece of food, I would experience an excruciating, burning, nauseous pain in the upper part of my stomach lining. He would elaborate to Nirvana biographer Michael Azerrad, I was determined to get a habit. I wanted to. It was my choice. I said, this is the only thing that's saving me from blowing my head off right now. I've been to 10 doctors and there's nothing they can do about it. I've got to do something to stop this pain. Quickly, a divide set among the Nirvana camp. There were those that did heroin and those that didn't. Dave, a relatively new character in Kurt's life, chose to stay distant in his disapproval, while Chris, one of Kurt's oldest friends, wasn't afraid of speaking bluntly. I remember literally telling him he was playing with dynamite. On the other side of the divide was, unfortunately, Kurt's fiancée. Courtney had suffered with various drug dependencies for much of her life, with heroin being a recent vice she had only barely managed to escape. Her friends had warned her that Kurt might be a bad influence for this very reason, that he would encourage a relapse. But Courtney saw the situation differently. It was like this: hey, you know what? I just sold 1 million fucking records, and I got $1 million, and I'm gonna share it with you, and let's get high. It was a mutual decision. Entering 1992 and approaching Nirvana's groundbreaking SNL performance, Kurt and Courtney had cultivated quite the nasty routine, having found a nice place in Los Angeles, far, far away from their friends and anyone who might disapprove. I just got up and got drugs and listened to music and painted and played guitar. That's about it. Watched TV. It was a recuperation. I'd been on tour for 7 months. I needed to do that. And although I must insist this was bad and you should not do this, they were happy. They were comfortable in their inactivity. Especially with Kurt turning down any plans for the massive worldwide arena tour expected of any band their size, 1992 was looking like Cobain's dream year. Then came the setback. No, not the overdose. Funnily enough, after being found not breathing by his panicking fiancée, Cobain was quickly revived and felt well enough to do a photo shoot for the teen magazine Sassy later that day. To quote the frontman's biography, Kurt had turned down requests from the New York Times and Rolling Stone, yet he'd agreed to do this piece because he felt the magazine was so silly. No. The setback came instead from a seemingly innocent discovery. Within days of Kurt's overdose, Courtney would reveal that she was pregnant. Like many of you, Kurt assumed the worst. Though he had expressed a desire to have kids with Courtney in the past, the plan was to wait until after they had cleaned up their act and settled down. Not only were they far from that in January, the pregnancy had started in early December, when the couple were at their peak drug usage, and Cobain took this to mean that the baby would be born sickly or disabled. Thankfully, Courtney spoke with some specialists who said otherwise, and the two grew determined to make the pregnancy work. At the advice of one of those doctors, the couple made their way to a cheap motel, where they would spend the next 3 days attempting a painful detox. For Courtney, the effort paid off, keeping her mostly sober for the rest of the pregnancy. For Kurt, things would not be so simple. Just 2 weeks after the motel, Nirvana flew off to Australia for a short tour of the Pacific, and though Cobain found plenty to enjoy about the trip, especially upon discovering Hello Kitty, sobriety mixed with the chaos of the tour inevitably meant the return of his stomach pain. And in what would quickly become a pattern, it had only gotten worse. The pain left me immobile, doubled up on the bathroom floor, vomiting water and blood. I was literally starving to death. My weight was down to about 100 pounds. Fortunately, this wouldn't last long, as a local doctor would prescribe Kurt Fiseptone, which miraculously erased the pain. Unfortunately, Fiseptone was the Australian name for methadone, a weak opioid, so without realizing it, Cobain had relapsed. By the end of Nirvana's tour in Hawaii, the frontman's addiction was back in full swing, and the timing couldn't have been worse. Courtney had flown out to visit, and on a whim, they decided to elope. Although the ceremony came abruptly, the choice to have only 8 guests in attendance was an intentional one, with the couple refusing to fly out any family and even barring some friends already in Hawaii from coming, most notably the wife of Nirvana's bassist, Shelly Hyarchus. Kurt had known Shelly almost as long as he'd known Chris. The two started dating long before Nirvana even formed, but now Kurt was acting openly hostile towards the couple. Growing paranoid of gossip and frustrated over some comments made earlier in the tour, she was labeled by Kurt and Courtney as unsupportive of the relationship. Novoselic, for his part, defended his wife completely, telling his bandmate that he wouldn't go without her. But Cobain didn't care. The wedding of Courtney Love and Kurt Cobain was held on February 24th, 1992, at Waikiki Beach in Honolulu. At sunset, they said their vows. The groom was high on heroin, and his best friend sat alone in a hotel room. Kurt was in his own world at that point. After that, I was pretty estranged from him. It was never the same. We talked about the direction of the band somewhat, but there really was no direction of the band after that. The next time Novoselic would see Cobain, he was sober again. It was March, not even a month after the wedding, and Nirvana were being interviewed by Rolling Stone for the first time. Cobain had been pretty open in the past about his disdain for the magazine, even drafting a letter to them that read, "We wouldn't benefit from an interview because the average Rolling Stone reader is a middle-aged ex-hippie turned hypocrite who embraces the past as the glory days and has a kinder, gentler, more adult approach towards the new liberal conservatism." God, I wish he sent that letter. Instead, Kurt found a more polite compromise and graced the cover with a shirt that read, "Corporate magazines still suck," alongside his bandmates. And while the Rolling Stone story would make it seem that Nirvana hardly had any issues to begin with, what came after proved otherwise. The next time the band were united, it was with their lawyers present. When Nevermind first released, the band signed a contract agreeing to an equal distribution of songwriting royalties. A generous deal from Kurt's perspective, considering he wrote basically everything, but a necessary one if the whole group were expected to live off the sales of a moderately successful rock album. However, much to everyone's surprise, Nevermind was not so moderately successful, and Kurt thought it was only fair to adjust the deal in response. He wrote roughly 80% of the music, so he should get roughly 80% of the money. Shockingly, his bandmates agreed, until Cobain expressed that he wanted the deal to be retroactive. This meant royalties that were already promised to Dave and Chris would now go to Kurt, which was in their eyes essentially theft. And though the band would eventually agree to a modified deal, after months of quiet tension, actual arguments started to erupt. At the time, I was ready to fucking quit the band over it. I couldn't believe that they were giving me so much shit about this. Further deepening the divide was yet another relapse. Kurt's addiction was only growing in intensity with each cycle of quitting and using. What was a moderate $100 daily habit in January had multiplied to a $400 one in May, leaving even those who used the drug with him in disbelief. Cobain's addiction would follow him on Nirvana's next tour, returning to Europe in June. Obviously, Kurt couldn't consistently find heroin in Finland, so the frontman acted responsibly. To avoid withdrawals and the now inevitable stomach pain, he preemptively started taking methadone. Unfortunately, he forgot one morning and woke up in the back of an ambulance. Making matters worse, this was the morning of their first show, meaning they had a lot of eyes on them. Immediately, rumors started spreading that Cobain had overdosed, and while there had always been quiet chatter of the frontman's drug abuse, for the first time, reporters were making some bold accusations. And now, with the accountants still hiring bulldozers to gather up the money, they've begun to blow it via smack, the biggest sucker punch of the lot. From nobodies to superstars to fuck-ups in the space of 6 months, that had to be a record. This was a bad look for Mr. Cobain, and oddly Mrs. Cobain, who took a lot of the blame in the article. In the tradition of Yoko Ono and every other loud wife of a guy who does dumb things, Courtney would often get the finger pointed at her when Kurt made a mistake, but the newlyweds' bad luck had only just begun. Honestly, that sentence sums up this whole video pretty well. On the same night Kurt was due to perform in Madrid, Courtney began having contractions, immediately setting off fears of a premature birth. Of course, she had them right before we had to play a show, so I had to play a show wondering if Courtney's going to die or if she's going to have a baby. Thankfully, when Kurt escaped to the hospital an hour later, he found that neither was the case, though he still chose to cancel the remaining shows and stay home for the rest of the pregnancy. That is, until they got home and found it flooded. In a case of tragic irony, Kurt had hid all of the couple's prized possessions in the home's bathtub to avoid burglary, which is right where the flood began. Quickly, Cobain's management stepped in and hooked him up with a new rental, but the damage was done. All this chaos, the stomach pain, the ambulance ride, the rumors, the contractions, the Spanish hospital, the flood, it weighed on them hard. For Kurt, even reaching a point where, shockingly, heroin wasn't enough. I ended up doing a $100 shot in one shot and not even feeling it hardly. At that point, it was like, why do it? Only weeks away from Courtney's due date, the couple took drastic measures, with Kurt checking into the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center for a proper detox, and Courtney following soon after for her own reasons. I was going to go crazy. I was going to take drugs. I've never been a person to take drugs in a crisis. I usually take drugs when I'm happy. I felt really like killing myself. I was 8.5 months pregnant. I couldn't kill myself, so I checked into a hospital for 2 weeks before the baby was born. The next few weeks would be some of the worst of Kurt Cobain's life. Not only would he have to be carefully weaned off of what had become a substantial heroin dependency, the strain put on his mind and body brought on the worst stomach pain yet, and all without access to his usual relievers. It was in this state that Kurt found himself on the morning of August 18th, as a panicked Courtney raced into his room and screamed, "You get out of this bed and you come down now! You are not leaving me to do this by myself. F*** you!" Although confused, groggy, and anguished, Kurt soon grasped the weight of the moment. His wife was in labor, and he needed to be by her side. So he dragged his IV stand through the hospital and into the delivery wing, pushing through the pain and holding her hand as she struggled through contractions. It was a beautiful moment. Briefly. Unfortunately, real life isn't much like the Hollywood biopic they'll soon make for Cobain, and quickly, the tides turned on the situation. I'm having the baby. It's coming out. He's puking. He's passing out, and I'm holding his hand and rubbing his stomach while the baby's coming out of me. It was pretty weird. In spite of his best efforts, Kurt Cobain would be unconscious at the moment of his child's birth. But when he woke, he was face to face for the first time with his life's greatest joy. Frances Bean Cobain. Although initially fearful of how the couple's mistakes would affect the newborn, all of that would vanish on sight of their healthy 7-pound daughter. With the hopes of dissuading any further rumors of the Cobain family's carelessness, Nirvana's management released a statement emphasizing Frances's health and the family's stability. Sadly, no one cared, as another voice would soon come and completely reshape the public's view of the pregnancy. The next day, as Love recovered from the birth of their child, the young couple received a copy of the September issue of Vanity Fair. In it was a profile of Courtney, coming just months after her band signed a $1 million deal with DGC. Off the heels of countless offers from other major labels, she had naively thought that the opportunity was just another rung on the ladder of success, expecting the same praise and flattery she was getting from the UK rock magazines, just with a bigger reader base. But this was not a rock magazine. This was Vanity Fair, whose audience consisted mostly of middle American moms who hated rock stars, with contributors who were eager to please that audience. Thus, the journalist who met with Courtney and wrote the article was less than accommodating. In Strangelove, Courtney is painted out to be a conniving opportunist, only interested in Kurt for his money, and Cobain as nothing more than a sickly servant to his wife, who didn't do much more than drink until he met Courtney. Together, they were portrayed as a Sid and Nancy for the 90s, self-destructive drug addicts with nowhere to go but down. After reading it together, Courtney was hurt. She had trusted the writer implicitly and let her into their home. But Kurt was inconsolable. He grasped better than his wife the implications of these words. A teen rock magazine calls Kurt a heroin addict and people roll their eyes, but Vanity Fair does it, and it becomes fact. Something not taken lightly in the midst of America's war on drugs. So he reminded Courtney of a promise the two had made at the beginning of the pregnancy. That, to quote his biography, if it appeared they would lose their baby for any reason, they would kill themselves in a double suicide. Courtney considered the option for a moment, but not for very long. She thought first of Frances and turned him down. The next day, Kurt was found in a nearby room of the delivery wing, overdosed on heroin. Love would later confess to an interviewer that he almost died. Thankfully, this was a hospital, and Kurt was quickly revived, but it would unfortunately seem that his fears were not unfounded. The article did just what he expected. It validated what were once fringe rumors, and everything quickly got out of hand. The very same day as Cobain's overdose, a social worker arrived at the hospital with a copy of September's Vanity Fair. Just days later, the family's first court hearing was held, and they lost custody of Frances. You should have seen him with that kid. He could just sit and stare at her for hours. He was as adoring as any father would be. Kurt and Courtney were devastated. Their worst fear had become a reality. But it wasn't hopeless. The court was convinced to put Frances under the guardianship of Love's half-sister, who soon moved next door to the couple. And as their lawyers continued working to save their family in court, Kurt tried to do the same in public. After months of rare appearances and tours cut short, it had been a long time since Nirvana had a chance at big publicity. And with the Reading Festival happening just days after the court ruling, Kurt would not miss his chance. There, in front of an audience of 60,000 adoring fans at one of the biggest rock festivals in the world, Kurt Cobain emerged in a wheelchair. A hush fell among much of the crowd as Krist lamented into the microphone, "It's too painful. This is too painful. You're gonna make it, man." While he walked off to his side of the stage, Kurt pulled himself just barely up to the microphone and began whispering a soft rendition of The Rose by Bette Midler, before collapsing and breaking into a crashing performance of Breed. It said everything. That night, he proved something important, not just to the crowd and the reporters, but to the members of his own band. "You're wrong about me." Thanks to fame, love, drugs, and a baby, everything changed for Nirvana in 1992. But it wasn't the end. You may have noticed that certain aspects of this video, and many of my recent videos for that matter, were pretty obviously censored. Something I hope you understand is out of my control. Simply because you couldn't have watched this on YouTube otherwise. It wouldn't have appeared in your recommendations. There's just no way to explore Nirvana's story uncensored on this platform. But it's pretty straightforward on Nebula, where you can see all of my past and future videos as they were intended to be seen as soon as they're finished. Nebula is an independent creator-owned streaming service that emboldens me and countless others to tell our stories completely uncompromised and uncensored, all without any ads or sponsors getting in the way. Like The Wonder of It All, a Nebula-exclusive podcast about the blessings and curses of success. Sean Nelson, former lead singer of Harvey Danger, interviews artists, musicians, filmmakers, TV creators, actors, writers, etc. about the ways their lives and careers were shaped by a conspicuous breakthrough, and how the experience changed their lives and careers for good and ill. And really, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Some of my favorite creators have been uploading original and exclusive videos to Nebula for years now, and I bet some of yours have been too. Especially on the music side of things, with the likes of Polyphonic, Mary Spender, 12-Tone, Middle 8, and Todd in the Shadows, all calling Nebula home. So check out my uncensored catalog, The Wonder of It All, and many, many more amazing stories by going to nebula.tv/markbutevil to get 40% off. Because with old Marky's code, Nebula is just $36 a year, and I assure you, it's as captivating as it is affordable. That's nebula.tv/markbutevil to get a year for just $36. $3 a month. I'd like to give a special thanks to these wonderful sources, and to you for watching till the end. Be sure to check out these videos as well, like if you liked it, subscribe if you want more. I'm gonna leave now. Goodbye.